Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle something that might feel like a bit of a paradox. We are bridging the gap between the incredibly fluid, empathetic nature of your contemplative counseling work and the strict, necessary, kind of rigid structures of empirical research. Now, I know, if you're a clinical mental health counseling master student in our Buddhist-informed cohort, you might be wondering, how in the world do CAC-REP standards and strict research methods fit into a practice that's literally built on presence and mindfulness? Well, let's dive right into it. We're going to look closely at Chapter 2 of Barrio, Minton, and Lenz's textbook, and we'll see exactly how these metrics don't hinder us, but actually enhance our capacity to relieve human suffering. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the foundations of counseling research. Second, the role of theory. Third, from concepts to constructs. Fourth, understanding variables in action. Fifth, populations and sampling methods. And finally, number 6, applying research to practice. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Foundations of Counseling Research. Let's ground ourselves in exactly why we use these methodologies in the first place. Think of your analytical process like a giant funnel. Up at the very top, we've got our broad, abstract observations of the world, and right down at the narrow bottom, we have our highly specific, measurable outcomes. You know, methodological concepts aren't just dry, boring academic requirements to check off a list. They are absolutely vital tools. Honestly, consider them a form of clinical mindfulness. They help us systematically observe, decode, and ultimately alleviate suffering by bringing an intense, structured awareness to what is literally happening with our clients right in front of us. Moving right along to Section 2, the role of theory. Because every intentional evaluation starts with a solid theory. In the social and behavioral sciences, theory is formally defined as a set of interrelated concepts, definitions, and propositions that explains or predicts events by specifying relations among variables. Now, I know the word theory can sometimes sound like dry academic jargon, right? But it is so much more than that. It is the fundamental philosophical lens we use to predict why something happens or how a client's healing process actually works. It's the map we use to navigate the incredibly complex territory of the human mind. Whether you're exploring Carl Rogers' belief in the self-actualizing tendency, the idea that humans naturally move toward growth if given the right conditions, or maybe Thomas Joiner's ideas on how thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness can lead to suicidal behavior, theory is what anchors you. It provides a real, tangible container for the client's deeply human experience, allowing us to frame their suffering and formulate a clear path forward. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, from concepts to constructs. So, how do we make these massive theories scientifically useful? There's a really subtle but honestly vital distinction we need to make here. Concepts are the abstract ideas we hold conceptually in our minds, things like weight or that self-actualizing tendency we just mentioned. We can't actually observe them directly. Constructs, on the flip side, are strictly formulated versions of those concepts that we can definitively measure in the physical therapy room. They are built specifically and entirely for scientific inquiry. Let's look at the formal definition. A construct is defined so it can be observed and measured. And, defining a construct is exactly like setting a really clear, mindful intention before a therapy session. It lets you operationalize the invisible. You are literally turning an abstract, floating feeling into something you can track, assess, and deeply support, like how Joiner took the super abstract concept of suicide risk and formulated a measurable construct like acquired capability. Section 4, Understanding Variables in Action. As we travel further down our funnel, those constructs become variables. At the core of the whole variable ecosystem is a pretty simple relationship. Independent variables are the foundational conditions, maybe demographic givens, or the specific counseling interventions we decide to introduce. They are the cause. Dependent variables are the resulting client outcomes, or the changes in their symptoms. They are the effect. So, for example, if we introduce a mindfulness intervention, that's our independent variable, we can then measure the reduction in their anxiety symptoms, which is our dependent variable. Makes sense, right? But hey, human beings are incredibly complex, and the relationship between variables is almost never just point A to point B. We've got to be aware of variables that interact behind the scenes. We have moderating variables that affect the strength of relationships, like how deep feelings of loneliness might exacerbate trauma symptoms. And we also have confounding variables that can totally obscure our understanding unexpectedly. Imagine a sudden blaring fire drill causing a massive spike in a student's anxiety right at the exact moment we're trying to measure the success of a calming intervention. We have to be deeply aware of the whole picture. Once we've nailed down our variables, we have to actually assign values to them.
We do this through things like self-identification, survey instruments, or specific behavioral assessments. And listen, assigning a value to a variable isn't about reducing a complex client down to a simple number. It's not stripping them of their humanity. Instead, it's about systematically listening to and categorizing their experience so we can see, without a doubt, if our therapeutic approach is actually working for them. It really is a compassionate commitment to effectiveness. All right, zooming out a bit for Section 5, populations and sampling methods. Let's look at the actual groups of people we are trying to help. Here, we need to clearly differentiate between the population and the sample. The population is the vast, overarching universe of all potential clients out there experiencing a certain phenomenon. Say, every single adult who has experienced interpersonal violence in the past year. Now, since we obviously can't reach everyone in the universe, we rely on the sample, the mindful, highly specific subset of individuals we actually have the capacity to sit with, evaluate, and care for in our study. When you're gathering that subset, you've got to make some very intentional choices. We might use probability sampling, where we rely on random selection so we can mathematically represent and generalize our findings to that entire population. Or we might go with non-probability sampling. That's where we deeply understand one specific group, relying on incredibly rich descriptions to see if those localized truths transfer gracefully over to other contexts. This actually brings us to a super practical tool right out of the textbook, Box 2.2. The checklist for creating a sampling procedure. Down the road, when you're designing evaluations for your own community agencies, returning to foundational checklists exactly like this one will ensure your sampling plan stays highly intentional. It keeps you grounded. It ensures you don't accidentally introduce problematic confounds that could totally skew your understanding of what your community actually needs. And finally, Section 6, applying research to practice. Let's bring this whole shebang together. At the most fundamental level, these elements deeply influence what we are actually able to learn from all of our efforts. Remember, whether you are evaluating a sweeping citywide wellness program or you're just sitting quietly in a room with a single hurting client, the level of care you put into defining your constructs and identifying your variables directly determines the clarity of the healing you can facilitate. Simply put, good research methods equate to good, clear-sighted counseling. So I want to leave you with this one vital question to really chew on. How will you operationalize your compassion into measurable change? Look, empirical research isn't some departure from your contemplative roots, not at all. Rather, it is the ultimate tool to clearly, undeniably demonstrate that your mindful interventions actually reduce human suffering. By mastering theory, constructs, and variables, you ensure your deep empathy translates into real-world, undeniable impact. So how are you going to measure your impact? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I truly hope this reframes exactly how you look at counseling research.